In the summer of 1995, the quiet mountain community of Pine Ridge, California, was unsettled by a discovery that would resurrect ghosts from 12 years past. A child's scream had echoed through the forest, followed by the frantic calls of counselors searching for a camper who had wandered off the marked trail. But 12 years later, when Detective Sarah Chen stumbles upon a rusted cage hidden deep in a limestone cave, she uncovers a truth so disturbing it would unravel the very fabric of a family's disappearance and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke as Sarah's unmarked sedan wound up the narrow mountain road. Her radio crackled with static, the signal weakening with each mile of elevation gained. Through her windshield, she caught glimpses of Pine Ridge Summer Camp, weathered wooden cabins nestled among towering pines, their red roofs barely visible through the canopy. Sarah had driven 3 hours from Sacramento after receiving the call. A 10-year-old camper named Tommy Morrison had discovered something in the caves during an unauthorized adventure. The local sheriff's department was overwhelmed, understaffed, and had specifically requested a detective with experience in cold cases. She parked beside the main lodge, a rustic building with wraparound porches and carved wooden signs pointing toward various camp activities. The sound of children's laughter drifted from the lake, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the adult voices. She heard hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez met her at the main office, his face pale, despite the warm morning sun. "Detective Chen, thank God you're here. We've got something that's going to reopen the Rodriguez case." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had read the file during the drive, a family of 4 who had vanished from Cabin 7 in August 1983. Parents Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, along with their children Sofia, age 8, and Diego, age 6. The cabin door had been forced open, belongings scattered across the floor, and half-burnt candles still flickering on the nightstand when they were discovered missing the next morning. No ransom demands, no bodies, no leads that led anywhere substantial. "Show me," Sarah said, adjusting her badge on her belt. The metal felt cold against her palm, and she noticed her hands were already beginning to sweat. Deputy Martinez led Sarah down a dirt path that meandered between the cabins, his boots crunching on fallen pine needles. The smell of breakfast bacon and pancakes wafted from the dining hall, but neither of them spoke as they walked. Sarah noticed how the other staff members watched them pass their conversations, dying mid-sentence. The Rodriguez family checked in on August 15, 1983. Martinez began consulting a worn notebook. Miguel was a construction foreman from Fresno. Carmen taught elementary school. They'd saved for 2 years to afford this place. His voice carried the weight of a story told too many times. Cabin 7 was their dream vacation. They stopped before a small log structure with forest green shutters and a stone chimney. The number 7 hung slightly crooked on the door, painted in yellow that had faded over the years. Sarah could see fresh wood around the doorframe, repairs made long after the original incident. The family was last seen at the evening campfire on August 18th, Martinez continued. Carmen had mentioned to another guest that Sofia was excited about the stargazing activity planned for the next night. Diego had made friends with a boy from Cabin 12. Everything seemed normal. Sarah walked closer to the cabin, running her fingers along the rough-hewn logs. Who discovered them missing? Housekeeping the next morning. When the family didn't show for breakfast, staff knocked. No answer. They used the master key and found chaos inside. Martinez's jaw tightened. Furniture, overturned suitcases, emptied clothes everywhere. But here's what still haunts everyone. Those candles on the nightstand were still burning. Halfway melted, but burning. The detective tried to picture the scene, a family of 4 vanishing in the middle of the night, leaving behind flickering flames that suggested they'd left recently or that someone had been there after they disappeared. Any signs of struggle, blood? None. That's what made it so strange. All that destruction but no violence indicators. The local investigation focused on voluntary disappearance, initially maybe financial troubles, maybe running from something. But Miguel's wallet was still in the cabin. Carmen's jewellery, including her wedding ring, was scattered on the dresser. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Families didn't abandon their children's favourite stuffed animals and their life savings. They didn't leave candles burning as they fled into the night. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself following a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the forest, away from the cheerful sounds of camp activities. Deputy Martinez moved ahead of her, occasionally holding back low-hanging branches. The path grew steeper, and she could hear the distant sound of water dripping in hidden places. Tommy Morrison was exploring off-limits. Martinez explained, his breathing slightly laboured from the climb. Kid's got a reputation for pushing boundaries. His counsellor realised he was missing during afternoon rest period. They found him about a quarter mile from here, sitting by a tree crying. The cave entrance appeared suddenly, a jagged opening in the limestone cliff face, partially hidden by overgrown ferns and moss. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, and Sarah could smell something metallic and stale emanating from within. Deputy Martinez handed her a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as they ducked inside. The cave extended farther than Sarah had expected, opening into a chamber roughly the size of a small bedroom. Her flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing what had terrified young Tommy Morrison. Children's drawings were taped to the rough stone surfaces. Crayon sketches of stick figures holding hands, houses with triangular roofs, and suns with smiling faces. Innocent images that became sinister in this underground tomb. Jesus, Sarah whispered, her voice echoing off the walls. But the drawings weren't the worst discovery. In the centre of the chamber sat a rusted metal cage roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet high, large enough for a child to crouch inside but not stand. The metal showed signs of prolonged exposure to moisture, and several bars had been bent outward as if someone had tried to escape. Around the cage's base, scattered bones had been arranged in a crude 5-pointed star pattern. Sarah knelt carefully, noting that most appeared to be animal bones, rabbit, perhaps small deer, but her stomach churned at the thought that some might be human. The drawings, she said, standing slowly. They're not random. Look at the paper. Martinez directed his light where she pointed. The artwork wasn't drawn on typical children's construction paper. These were camp activity sheets, the kind used for structured crafts, complete with the Pine Ridge Summer Camp logo, printed in small letters at the bottom. Back at the main lodge, Sarah spread the case files across a wooden table worn smooth by decades of use. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across photographs and witness statements that had grown yellow with age. The camp director, a nervous man named Paul Hendricks, brought her coffee in a chipped mug that read Pine Ridge 1987. We need to start with the suspects from the original investigation, Sarah said, opening the thickest folder. Tell me about Marcus Webb. Hendricks' face darkened immediately. Marcus owned Wilderness Adventures Camp about 15 miles south of here, our biggest competitor. He sat across from Sarah, his hands clasped tightly. The rivalry got ugly in the early 80s. Parents were choosing between our camps, and Marcus didn't handle the competition well. Sarah studied Webb's photograph, a man in his 40s with thick brown hair and intense eyes. According to the file, he had publicly accused Pine Ridge of safety violations and had been overheard at a local restaurant saying that Pine Ridge would get what was coming to it. He filed 3 formal complaints with the county about our practices in the months before the Rodriguez family disappeared. Hendricks continued. Claims about unsafe hiking trails, inadequate supervision, faulty equipment. All of them were investigated and dismissed, but the damage to our reputation was real. The detective flipped through witness statements. 2 different sources had reported seeing Webb's pickup truck parked along the access road to Pine Ridge on August 18th, the night the family vanished. When questioned, Webb claimed he'd been fishing at a nearby creek alone, with no witnesses to corroborate his alibi. What sealed it for the original investigators was Webb's reaction when they interviewed him, Hendricks said. He showed no surprise about the disappearance, no shock, no concern for the children, just kept insisting that Pine Ridge was a dangerous place and that something like this was bound to happen. Sarah made notes in the margin of the file. Webb had motive opportunity and suspicious behaviour. But something nagged at her as she read the details. Who arranged the camp supplies for activities? She asked absently. Different people over the years, Hendricks replied. Our volunteer coordinator usually handles craft supplies and educational materials. Why? Just trying to understand the logistics. Sarah turned the page, but couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to this question mattered more than anyone realized. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the mountainside, muffling sounds and creating an eerie atmosphere as Sarah interviewed the camp's former staff. She had spent the night at a nearby motel, but sleep had been elusive. The image of that cage kept returning to her dreams. Derek Mills arrived at the lodge precisely on time despite having driven 4 hours from Bakersfield. He was a lean man with greying temples and calloused hands, wearing a pressed flannel shirt that looked like it had been purchased specifically for this meeting. When he sat down across from Sarah, she immediately noticed how his eyes never quite met hers. I heard about what they found in the cave, Mills said before Sarah could begin her questions. Terrible business. I always knew something like this would surface eventually. Sarah studied his personnel file. Derek Mills had worked as a counsellor at Pine Ridge for 3 summers, ending abruptly in 1984, 1 year after the Rodriguez disappearance. Multiple complaints from parents described his harsh disciplinary methods and inappropriate behaviour toward children who misbehaved. Tell me about your relationship with the Rodriguez family, Sarah began. Mills shifted uncomfortably. I didn't have much interaction with them. They kept to themselves mostly. Quiet people. The kids were well behaved. He paused, picking at his fingernails. Look, I know what people said about me back then, about being too strict, but these kids today, they need structure, discipline. Their parents don't teach them respect. Several witnesses reported seeing you arguing with Miguel Rodriguez the day before they disappeared, Sarah pressed. What was that about? Mills' jaw tightened. His boy Diego had been caught stealing candy from the camp store. I was trying to teach him a lesson about consequences. Miguel didn't appreciate my methods. His voice carried a bitter edge. Parents these days want to be their children's friends instead of teaching them right from wrong. Sarah noted how Mills spoke about the missing family in past tense, as if he knew they were dead. Where were you on the night of August 18th? In my cabin. I had duty that night, supposed to be doing security rounds, but I wasn't feeling well, so I went to bed early. Mills looked directly at her for the first time. I know how that sounds. No alibi. But I had nothing to do with whatever happened to that family. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, and Sarah felt the familiar chill of an investigation taking a dark turn. That afternoon, Sarah drove down a winding dirt road that bordered the camp property, heading toward the Hartman farm. The fog had lifted, revealing a patchwork of fields and pasture land that stretched toward distant hills. Bill Hartman's property was marked by a weathered wooden sign that simply read, Hartman Ranch, Est, 1952. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a red barn equipment sheds, and what appeared to be an old smokehouse. Sarah could smell livestock and hay mixed with the acrid scent of something burning in the distance. Bill Hartman emerged from the barn before she'd even parked, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was a stocky man in his 70s now, with weathered skin and eyes that held decades of resentment. His initial stance was defensive, shoulders squared, as if preparing for a fight. "You're here about Pine Ridge," he said without preamble. "Figured someone would come around eventually after what that kid found." Sarah introduced herself and followed Hartman to his porch, where they sat in mismatched chairs that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. "Tell me about your dispute with the camp." Hartman's face darkened. "Dispute? That's what they called it." He gestured toward the tree line that marked the property boundary. "My grandfather homesteaded this land in 1902, built this place with his own hands. Then some city investors come in the 70s, buy up the adjacent property and turn it into a playground for rich kids." According to the case files, the conflict had escalated in 1982, when Pine Ridge expanded their hiking trails onto land that Hartman claimed belonged to him. The legal battle had consumed his savings and ended with the court ruling in favor of the camp's surveyed boundaries. "They poisoned my well water with their septic runoff," Hartman continued, his voice rising. "Scared my cattle with their noise. Kids would wander onto my property, leave gates open, trash everywhere." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with old anger. "That Rodriguez fellow was the worst. Caught him letting his kids pick my apples without permission." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You had contact with Miguel Rodriguez?" "Damn right I did. Told him to keep his family on their side of the fence. He got mouthy about it, said I was just a bitter old man who hated children having fun." Hartman's hands clenched into fists. "Nobody talks to me like that on my own land." The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the porch and carrying with it the sound of children's laughter from the distant camp. Hartman's expression grew even darker at the sound. Sarah returned to Pine Ridge as the sun began its descent behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the camp grounds. The interview with Hartman had left her unsettled. His anger toward the Rodriguez family was genuine and deep, but something about his demeanor suggested a man who fought his battles in daylight, not through midnight abductions. The main lodge was quieter now, with most campers engaged in evening activities down by the lake. Sarah found Director Hendricks in his office, reviewing what appeared to be insurance documents. He looked up as she knocked on the open door. "Any luck with our neighbours?" he asked, setting down his reading glasses. "Bill Hartman certainly had motive," Sarah replied. "But I'd like to understand more about the camp's internal operations in 1983. Who would have had access to supplies, schedules, family information?" "That would be our volunteer coordinator," Hendricks said. "Eleanor Finch has been with us longer than anyone. Started volunteering here in 1979, I think. Still comes by regularly, even though she's officially retired." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the office door. A woman in her 70s appeared, carrying a tray with steaming mugs and what appeared to be homemade cookies. She was small and unassuming, with silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I thought you might need some coffee," Eleanor Finch said, with a gentle smile. "I saw the detective's car and assumed you were working late on that terrible business in the cave." Hendricks made introductions, and Sarah noticed how Eleanor's handshake was firm, despite her delicate appearance. "I understand you've been here since the beginning," Sarah said. "Nearly 20 years now," Eleanor replied, settling into a chair as if she'd been invited to stay. "I started volunteering after my husband passed. Harold always said I was too much of a busybody to sit home alone." Her laugh was warm and self-deprecating. I suppose I know every nook and cranny of this place by now. Sarah accepted the offered coffee, noting how Eleanor seemed to study her face intently. You would have been here during the Rodriguez incident. Oh, yes, that poor family. Eleanor's expression grew solemn. I remember them well. Such lovely children. Sophia had the most beautiful drawings. She spent hours in the craft room, working on presents for her parents. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I kept hoping they'd just wandered off and gotten lost, but as the days passed... Eleanor lingered in the office, longer than Sarah expected, her presence somehow both comforting and oddly persistent. As she spoke about the Rodriguez family, her recollections were remarkably detailed, almost photographically precise, in a way that struck Sarah as unusual for events that had occurred 12 years earlier. Sophia always used the purple crayons first. Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. She would outline everything in purple before filling in with other colors. And little Diego, he was fascinated by the cave systems around here, always asking questions about where they led, how deep they went. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The caves? That's interesting. How did he know about them? Oh, we had a nature education program back then, Eleanor replied smoothly. I used to take small groups on educational walks, pointing out geological formations and wildlife habitats. Diego was always my most attentive student. After Eleanor left to help with evening cleanup, Sarah remained in Hendrix's office, spreading out witness statements and timeline documents. Something was nagging at her small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a pattern. She pulled out her notebook and began cross-referencing details. According to the official timeline, the Rodriguez family had been last seen at the evening campfire on August 18th, but 3 different witnesses placed them at 3 different locations that same evening. The camp's official log showed Eleanor conducting a late evening nature walk with several families, but none of the participating families mentioned the Rodriguez family in their statements. Most troubling was Eleanor's detailed knowledge of the children's behaviours and preferences. Sarah had interviewed dozens of people over the years, and she knew the difference between genuine memory and the kind of intimate knowledge that came from prolonged private observation. She opened Eleanor's volunteer file, noting how thin it was, despite nearly 20 years of service. Most volunteers accumulated thick folders of references, training certificates, and incident reports. Eleanor's contained only basic information and glowing recommendations from directors, including several who had since retired or moved away. The evening air carried the sound of children being called to their cabins for bed, and Sarah found herself thinking about Diego Rodriguez, asking questions about caves, about Sophia's careful purple outlines, about someone who knew every nook and cranny of the camp, who had access to supplies and schedules, who could move through the property without arousing suspicion. Someone who was trusted. Someone who was invisible. The next morning, Sarah returned to the cave with a forensics kit and a magnifying glass, determined to examine every detail she might have missed. The children's drawings looked even more disturbing. In the harsh light of her LED flashlight, their innocent subjects rendered sinister by their underground gallery. She carefully removed one of the drawings from the cave wall, noting how the tape still held strong adhesive despite the damp conditions. The paper felt familiar beneath her fingers, the same weight and texture as standard camp activity sheets. But it was the small detail in the corner that made her pulse quicken. A price tag. Tiny, almost invisible, but clearly visible under magnification, $2.99, Pine Ridge Craft Supplies. Sarah documented each drawing systematically, finding identical price tags on several pieces of paper and on a box of broken crayons scattered near the cage. These weren't materials brought from outside, they were supplies that had been taken directly from the camp's inventory. By noon, she was standing in the craft room, a cheerful space, filled with bins of construction paper paints and art supplies. The volunteer on duty, a college-aged woman named Jessica, seemed eager to help. "These price tags?" Sarah showed her the evidence bag. "Do you recognize the marking system?" Jessica examined the tag through the plastic. "Oh, sure, that's Eleanor's system. She's super organized about inventory, everything gets tagged and logged." She led Sarah to a cabinet filled with meticulously labeled supplies. "See, she marks everything with the date purchased and price paid. Been doing it for years." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "Eleanor manages all the craft supplies." "Pretty much. She orders, everything organizes. It keeps track of what's used for which activities. She's amazing, knows exactly what we need before we even ask." Jessica's admiration was genuine. She even keeps records of which kids used which supplies for their projects.
Says it helps her plan better for next time.
The detective stared at the organized shelves, her mind racing. Someone with access to detailed records about children's activities and preferences. Someone who tracked which supplies were used when and by whom. Someone who could remove items from inventory without anyone questioning their absence. "Jessica," Sarah asked carefully, "does Eleanor have keys to this room?" "Of course. She's here at all hours, sometimes restocking or preparing for activities. Mr. Hendricks gave her master access years ago. She's like family here." The sound of children's laughter drifted in from outside, but Sarah barely heard it. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in the camp's small administrative office, poring over old records and schedules. What she found made her blood run cold. Every inconsistency, every strange detail from the Rodriguez case had one common thread: Eleanor Finch. The evening campfire on August 18th, Eleanor had been the volunteer in charge of cleanup, giving her reason to remain near the Rodriguez family's cabin well after other guests had retired. The nature education program that had taught Diego about the cave systems Eleanor had designed and led it personally. The detailed knowledge of Sophia's artistic preferences, Eleanor had supervised the craft activities, where those habits would have been observed and recorded. Sarah pulled Eleanor's duty schedules from 1983, cross-referencing them with the family's activities. Eleanor had been present for every single event the Rodriguez family attended. More telling, she had volunteered for extra shifts that week, claiming she wanted to help with the busy summer schedule. The detective's hands trembled slightly as she opened the camp's incident reports from that time period. 3 separate complaints about Eleanor's overly attentive behaviour toward children, reports that had been dismissed as the grievances of overprotective parents. One mother had written, "Mrs. Finch seems to know more about my daughter's daily routine than I do. She asks too many questions about our home life and remembers details that seem inappropriate for a volunteer to track." Each complaint had been investigated by the camp director, at the time a man who had since retired and moved to Arizona. The reports concluded that Eleanor was simply a dedicated volunteer whose enthusiasm was being misinterpreted. Sarah found herself thinking about Eleanor's gentle demeanour, her homemade cookies, her warm smile. The perfect mask for someone who needed to get close to families without raising suspicion. Someone who could approach children without triggering their instinctive wariness of strangers. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the office windows when Sarah made another disturbing discovery. Eleanor's volunteer schedule showed a 2-week absence in September 1983, just 3 weeks after the Rodriguez disappearance. The reason listed personal emergency, family illness. But Eleanor's emergency contact information listed no living relatives. Her husband had died in 1978, and she had no children. Who exactly had been ill? Sarah reached for her phone to call the Arizona area code for the former camp director, but stopped when she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Eleanor's voice carried through the thin walls, offering to help the current staff with dinner preparations. The helpful volunteer, always present, always willing to assist, always watching. Sarah waited until the dinner hour, when most of the camp was gathered in the dining hall before seeking out Eleanor. She found her in the craft room, methodically organising supplies that were already perfectly arranged. Eleanor looked up with her familiar warm smile, but Sarah noticed something different in her eyes, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. "Detective Chen, how nice to see you again. Making progress with your investigation?" Eleanor's voice carried its usual gentle cadence, but her hands continued moving among the supplies, never quite still. "I've learned some interesting things about the Rodriguez case," Sarah said, closing the door behind her, "particularly about the cave discovery. Those art supplies were taken from this very room." Eleanor's smile never wavered, but her fingers tightened around a box of crayons. "How terrible. Someone must have broken in and stolen them. We've always had problems with security here." Sarah placed the evidence bags on the craft table photos of the price tags, the camp activity sheets, the meticulous inventory records. These supplies were signed out through proper channels, by someone with legitimate access, someone who tracked every crayon, every sheet of paper. For a moment, Eleanor's mask flickered. Her eyes darted to the evidence, then to the door, calculating distances and escape routes. When she looked back at Sarah, something cold and predatory had replaced the kindness. "You have such an imagination, detective. The Rodriguez family simply left. Families do that. Sometimes they run away from responsibilities, from debts, from lives that don't satisfy them." Eleanor's voice had lost its gentle warmth, becoming flat and clinical. Children are easily convinced to follow, especially when someone they trust explains that it's all just a game. Sarah felt ice in her veins. "You took them to the cave. You told them it was part of a special activity." Eleanor laughed, a sound completely devoid of the warmth she'd shown before. Sophia was so excited about the secret art project. Diego couldn't wait to explore the hidden classroom. They followed me so willingly, such trusting children. Her eyes grew distant, almost dreamy. They believed every word I said, right until the very end. The craft room felt smaller, suddenly, the cheerful decorations taking on a sinister cast. Sarah's hand moved slowly toward her radio, but Eleanor noticed the movement. "They weren't the first, you know." Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than anger. "And they wouldn't have been the last. But you've spoiled things now, haven't you?" Eleanor's hand moved toward a pair of craft scissors, but Sarah was already reaching for her radio. "Back up to Pine Ridge Summer Camp. Craft room, immediate assistance needed." The static response crackled through the small space as Eleanor's facade crumbled completely. 23 years I've been perfecting my methods, learning which families were isolated, which children were trusting, which parents wouldn't be missed quickly. Her voice carried the pride of someone discussing a professional accomplishment. The Rodriguez family was ideal, no local connections cash payment, no one expecting them home for days. Sarah kept her distance, noting how Eleanor's movements had become more agitated, more unpredictable. "You used your position here to study them, to plan." "Study?" Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "I cherished them. I gave them attention their parents never provided. Sophia showed me every drawing before she showed her mother. Diego trusted me with his fears about starting school." Her eyes blazed with a twisted maternal pride. I was the one who truly cared about them. The sound of running footsteps echoed in the hallway. Deputy Martinez burst through the door, followed by 2 state police officers who had been monitoring Sarah's radio communications. Eleanor looked from one face to another, realizing her game had finally ended. "Those bones in the cave," Sarah said, as Martinez placed Eleanor in handcuffs. "How many families Eleanor's smile returned cold and triumphant. Enough to keep me satisfied, not enough to satisfy what you'll find when you dig deeper into these mountains. As they led Eleanor away, Sarah looked at the cheerfully organised craft room one last time. The real journey was just beginning, searching for other victims, other families who had trusted the wrong person with their precious children. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but justice and truth endure. Later, as Sarah walked toward her car in the gathering dusk, she thought about the Rodriguez family and all the others Eleanor had destroyed. The sound of children's voices drifted from the dining hall, safe children protected now by the truth.
The hardest part is knowing we stopped her, she whispered to the mountaineer. But we did stop her,
Martinez replied, joining her by the cars. They stepped toward their vehicles, toward a future they would build with vigilance and care, one case at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.